Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and Gardener's Eye Saw Too Much, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Gardener Saw Too Much. They found the gardener's tongue, buried under the roses, still warm, as if it had tried to whisper a secret before death silenced it. That was the first line of the letter Father Brown received one grey afternoon in Kembleford. No name, no return address, just the shaking scrawl of a hand that had seen something too terrible to bear alone. At first glance, it seemed like the ravings of a madman. But Father Brown had seen too much madness in sane people to dismiss it so easily. The letter had arrived precisely 3 hours after the body of Harold Linton was found at the edge of the rectory's garden, sprawled face first in the wet earth, pruning shears still clenched in one fist. The local constable chalked it up to heart failure. Old man, poor diet, long day's work. But there were bruises on Linton's wrist that looked like fingerprints, and a single white gardenia lay beside him, uncrushed, untouched, deliberately placed. Father Brown stood over the grave the next day as the coffin lowered into the earth, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed not on the casket, but on the gardener's shed at the far end of the grounds. It had been bolted shut since the death. No one dared enter. They said the tools still moved at night. That evening, while the village slept under a low ceiling of mist, Father Brown slipped into the garden. The moon made pale ghosts of the hedges, and the shed creaked like something breathing. He opened the door with a rusted key he'd kept for years and stepped inside. It was colder than it should have been. The air smelled of iron and lavender. On the wooden workbench, a pair of boots sat neatly aligned, toes facing the door. Next to them, a trowel covered in something too dark to be soil. And on the wall, Father Brown saw it, with a slow, sinking dread, was a list written in charcoal. Names, dates, times, every name had a cross drawn beside it, except one, Father Brown. That night, he could not sleep. He paced his room until the candle burned down and the wind outside whispered like a dying man's breath. What could the gardener have known? What was he planning to confess? And why had someone made sure he never spoke again? 2 days later, the town's only gravedigger vanished. The same white gardenia was found floating in his rain barrel. The villagers said he'd gone to visit family in Derbyshire, but no one had seen him leave. Father Brown, against everyone's advice, walked to the churchyard and opened the gardener's grave. The coffin was empty. No one believed him. The priest must be tired. The stress, the old stories getting to his head. But Father Brown knew when he was being lied to, not by others, but by the world itself. The facts didn't fit. The gardener was dead. His body had been buried, but now it was gone. He returned to the shed. This time, he opened the floorboards. Beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a red silk ribbon, was a diary. Not the gardener's, someone else's. The first page was addressed not to a person, but to a tree. To the oak beside the well. You saw everything. The diary told stories no man should have known. Secrets of the villagers. Adultery, theft, even a name linked to a child gone missing in 1913. Every page darker than the last. The gardener hadn't just seen too much, he'd recorded it all. He'd been watching everyone for years, quietly digging up their sins while planting roses above them. But then came the most terrifying entry, the final one. They know I know. One of them came last night. I pretended to be asleep, but he stood there, just breathing. I'll hide this where only someone with faith would think to look. If you're reading this, I may already be dead, or worse, alive and buried. That single line shattered everything Father Brown thought he understood. What if the gardener hadn't died? What if he'd been silenced another way? Drugged, buried alive, entombed somewhere so deep beneath the village that his screams were mistaken for wind? And what of the tongue? The next morning, a bouquet of gardenias was placed on the church steps. No note, just a scent so strong it clung to Father Brown's cassock. He called the undertaker, asked to re-examine Linton's personal effects. There, hidden in the lining of the old man's coat, was a photograph. A woman crying beside a tree. The same oak from the diary. Her hands were clasped in prayer, but her eyes stared directly at the camera, at whoever had taken it. Father Brown returned to the tree that evening. Beneath its roots, hidden beneath a slab of stone, he found something else, a jar. Inside it, submerged in brine, was a tongue, still pink, still whole, still warm. The twist was not just that the tongue had been removed, but that someone had tried to preserve it, as if the tongue had something left to say, as if the truth had not yet spoken its final word. And then the birds stopped singing. The air turned heavy. Someone else was in the garden. He turned, a figure in a gardener's coat, mud caked to his boots, eyes wide, unblinking. "Mr. Linton," Father Brown whispered, but the man said nothing. He raised one hand and pointed to the diary in Father Brown's hand, then slowly turned and vanished into the hedge. No footsteps, no sound, nothing but the crushing silence of a truth that could never be spoken aloud. Back in his study that night, Father Brown placed the diary on his desk. He didn't open it, he didn't need to, because he finally understood. The gardener had not just seen too much, he had remembered it. And memory is the most dangerous thing in a village where everyone has something to hide. A week later, another death. A parish woman found drowned in the well near the oak. No one heard her scream. No one came to claim her body. But on her blouse, a single gardenia, pinned where a brooch might go. The constable called it suicide. Father Brown said nothing. He looked out his window toward the garden and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." The diary remains locked in the church vault, and the shed door creaks open on its own some nights. But no one enters anymore, because in Kembleford they now say, "It's not what the gardener saw, it's what saw the gardener." Chapter 2. Father Brown finds hidden eyes. The eyes weren't human, but they wept like they remembered being. It was nearly midnight when Father Brown first saw them, embedded in the wood of the confession booth, right behind where he had sat and listened to lies for nearly 20 years. They were small, glassy, almost like beads from a rosary, but they blinked, just once, and then they stared. Earlier that evening, he'd returned to the church after a tense meeting with the bishop's envoy. The diocese had heard troubling rumors, another disappearance, another gardenia left behind. The official church had no interest in ghosts or folklore, but Father Brown did, because he knew that evil rarely wore horns. It usually wore gloves and smiled politely. He lit a candle near the altar and sat for a moment, letting the silence settle like dust. But something was wrong. The air was too still, the shadows too deep. It felt as if someone had emptied the room of its holiness. That's when he noticed the eyes. At first he thought he was imagining them. Fatigue, perhaps. But when he leaned forward, the candlelight flickered across a face. No, not a face. A carving. An engraving beneath the polished surface of the confession booth's paneling. Two eyes, not painted, not etched, embedded. Someone had carved them into the wood, perfectly symmetrical, watching whoever sat on the other side of the screen. But more disturbingly, they weren't old. The lacquer hadn't dried yet. Father Brown stood up slowly. He didn't call for help. He didn't make the sign of the cross. He just stared at the booth as if it had spoken aloud. And in a way, it had. Because beneath the eyes, barely visible, were words scratched in with something sharp. I hear them lie. I see them die. That was the moment Father Brown knew the previous mystery. The gardener's death was only the surface. Someone had been watching, listening, collecting secrets from both sides of the booth. And worse, using confession as a hunting ground. He returned to his study and opened a drawer he hadn't touched in years. Inside was a small notebook filled with dates and initials, anonymous sins, confessed over the years. He had never written the full names, but even these fragments revealed something chilling. 3 of the initials matched people who had died under mysterious circumstances in the last 2 months. One had drowned, one had vanished, one had hanged himself in the bell tower. All of them had confessed something they claimed they could never say out loud again. And now, Father Brown feared, someone else had heard those secrets too. The next day, he asked Mrs. Doyle, the church keeper who had last cleaned the booths. Her hands shook as she answered, "No one's been in there, Father. Not since Linton was buried." "But someone must have been," he said. "The eyes, they're fresh." She looked up, her voice hoarse. "I've seen those eyes before. When I was a girl, right after the war, my uncle died screaming that the wood could see him. That evening, a child came to confession, 11 years old, eyes wide, voice small. He said he saw his father bury something in the church garden. A box, he whispered, wrapped in black cloth, and when he came back in the house, he smelled like fire." Father Brown walked the garden path alone that night. He carried no lantern, only memory. The soil was soft near the back wall, where the roses no longer grew. He dug with his bare hands. After an hour, his fingers struck metal. It was a box. Inside, 12 photographs. Each one showed a person from the village, taken from behind, sitting, walking, kneeling, unaware. But all of them were looking at something out of frame, something or someone watching from the shadows. In every photo, 2 tiny white dots could be seen in the corner. Eyes, always watching, always just out of reach. The final photograph made him pause. It was of the confessional, taken from the inside, from the priest's side. Whoever took it had sat where Father Brown now sat, and aimed the camera through the screen. The next Sunday, he delayed Mass. Instead, he invited everyone to sit quietly in the pews and began to speak. "Someone here has been collecting sins like seeds, planting them, and waiting for them to bloom into tragedy. But sin, you see, isn't what damns us, it's what we hide that does." The church was silent. Someone coughed, someone else whispered. That night, the confession booth caught fire. No one was in the church. The fire brigade said it started from within. The wood blackened, the curtains burned, the glass cracked. But when Father Brown entered the next morning, something waited inside the ashes. The eyes, still intact, still watching. The edges of the booth had charred to dust. But the inlaid carving of the eyes had not burned. They had only darkened, as if absorbing the fire, and beneath them, the words had changed. "Now you've seen me too." Father Brown didn't flinch. He whispered something under his breath, a prayer, or perhaps a challenge. Then he turned, walked to the altar, and opened the vault beneath it. Inside were the robes of the previous priest, Father Ainsley, gone 30 years, vanished without a trace. Everyone believed he had left the village after a nervous breakdown, but there had always been rumors, whispers, sins confessed that should never have been repeated. A priest driven mad by the darkness of others, or perhaps consumed by his own. And pinned to Ainsley's folded robe was a gardenia, fresh, white, perfect. That was the moment Father Brown knew this wasn't a copycat crime. It was older, deeper, a pattern long buried in the stone walls of the church. A pattern of watching, listening, judging, and sometimes silencing. But the mystery was no longer about the gardener, or the missing gravedigger, or even the photographer. It was about who had been listening in silence for decades, and how many had already died for what they whispered. He returned to the confessional one last time, though it was now only a shell. And inside, he found one final message, scratched into the floorboards beneath the ash. "You are next, Father." He didn't sleep that night, because the eyes had moved. They were no longer in the booth. They were behind his mirror, and he could feel them blinking, watching, waiting. And in that silence, Father Brown whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." And the mirror fogged up, not from his breath, but from something behind the glass. Chapter 3: Murder Hidden Beneath Garden Soil. They said the garden bloomed better after her death, but no one dared eat the vegetables. Father Brown stood silently by the parsonage fence, eyes fixed on the rows of tomato plants swaying in the late afternoon wind. There was something too vibrant about them, as if they had been fed more than rain and compost. The villagers had begun to whisper that the soil had changed. The roses grew taller, the roots reached deeper, and the children who played nearby came home with dreams they couldn't explain. It had been exactly 12 days since Margaret Elms disappeared. She had been a regular at morning mass, a widow known for her sharp tongue and sharper eyes. But one morning, her teacup sat untouched by the window, and the door to her cottage was unlocked. The kettle still warm, her hat still hanging by the door. Only the spade in her garden was missing, until it returned 3 nights later, left leaning neatly against her shed, wiped clean, not a fleck of dirt. No one in Kembleford wanted to dig, but Father Brown did. He began by speaking with the children, because they were the only ones not yet trained to lie. One girl, Bethany, said she heard singing in the soil. Another boy claimed he saw Mrs. Elms talking to the roots. And one child, barely 6, whispered that the scarecrow had blinked at her. These were tales easily dismissed, unless you knew, as Father Brown did, that madness often dances closest to those telling uncomfortable truths. The priest returned that evening with a lantern and a trowel, alone beneath a velvet black sky. He walked between the cabbage and potatoes, past the carrots, until he reached the roses. They were too symmetrical, too recent. Margaret had hated roses, always said they were the flowers of liars. And yet here they were, 12 of them, perfectly spaced, fresh. He dug. The first foot was nothing but soil. The second, richer, wetter. By the third, the smell began. Not rot, but perfume. Lilac, lavender, vanilla. And then, a bone. Small, round, a knuckle, wrapped in linen stained the color of rust. Beneath it, more cloth, a blouse, buttons still attached, and hair. A woman's braid. Blonde, fine, unmistakable. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Not until he saw the face. It wasn't Margaret's. It was her sister. Dead 10 years. Buried in a different village. Father Brown fell backward, breath catching in his throat. The moon caught the glint of something metallic just behind the root ball. An old pocket watch. He picked it up. It still ticked, and on the back a name was engraved. Father Ainsley. But Father Ainsley had vanished decades ago, and now his watch was buried in Margaret Elms's garden, tucked into the chest of a woman who shouldn't be here. The next day, no one mentioned Margaret. No one even looked toward her cottage. It was as if she had never existed, a ghost the town had collectively forgotten. But not Father Brown. He went to the church archives. He found Father Ainsley's last sermon, never delivered, never printed, just a transcript, unsigned, hidden in a drawer. The first line read, "We feed the earth, and the earth feeds us, but some soil remembers." The final page had a list of names. Margaret Elms was third. At evening mass, Father Brown stood at the pulpit. He spoke of gardens, of growth, of the comfort of routine. But his eyes never left the third pew, where a man named Geoffrey Tate sat with dirt beneath his fingernails. Tate, the florist, always smiling, always early, always quiet. After the service, Father Brown followed him to the greenhouse. He waited until the lights turned off, then he knocked. Tate opened the door slowly, his face pale, his eyes wild. "I've been expecting you," he said. They didn't speak of the watch, or the bones, or the roses. They spoke of smells, of how certain flowers only bloom after blood is spilled, of how roots twist differently when they grow around bone. Tate said nothing directly, but everything he said was a confession. Father Brown asked just one question. "Where is Margaret?" Tate smiled, too softly. "She's where she wanted to be, in the soil, with the others." The priest left, without a word. That night, he returned to Margaret's garden. He dug deeper. What he found wasn't a body, it was a room. Hollowed earth beneath the roots, reinforced with stone. A door, a handle. He pulled it open, and the candle blew out. In the darkness, something shifted. Wood creaked. A whisper danced around him, too quiet to catch. He relit the candle and saw eyes staring back at him. Not alive, painted. Hundreds of them, all around the chamber walls, each one different. Some crying, some wide with fear, some closed. He backed away, tripped, landed on something soft. A dress, Margaret's, folded, clean, smelling faintly of gardenia. There was no body, just her clothes, and a note, written in her handwriting. "The soil takes what it's given, and gives back only what you deserve." The final line was a signature, not hers. Ainsley. Father Brown returned to the rectory and locked the door. He sat for hours without speaking, staring at the soil caught beneath his fingernails. It was darker than any earth he'd ever touched, and it smelled not of death, but of memory. The next morning, the garden was gone, every plant dead, every rose wilted, the ground dry, cracked, as if it had never been watered. Tate had disappeared. The children no longer dreamed, and Father Brown stood before the altar, whispering, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because some seeds, once planted, never stop growing." Chapter 4. The flowers covered a corpse. The bouquet on her doorstep was still dripping with blood. It was the kind of thing no one wanted to talk about in a village like Kembleford, where everyone smiled too much, and grief was kept behind lace curtains. But that morning, Mrs. Adeline Brackett found a dozen freshly cut lilies laid at the threshold of her cottage, tied with a silk ribbon that bore her own name, in handwriting that had belonged to her sister, the same sister who had been dead for 18 years, the same sister whose grave Father Brown had personally blessed. Adeline didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply closed the door, locked all 4 bolts, and sat in silence, with her hands trembling on the arms of her chair. The flowers were still outside when the postman arrived, and by the time Father Brown was summoned, the petals had turned a pale, sickly grey, as if wilting from fear rather than time. Father Brown knelt beside the bouquet. He recognized the scent immediately. They weren't just lilies, there was wolfsbane mixed in, a poisonous plant, a warning, not a gift, and inside the bundle, tucked carefully beneath the stems, was something no ordinary florist would include. A tooth, human, cracked, with the root still attached. He picked it up with a handkerchief, turning it in the morning light. The enamel was chipped. A small filling gleamed in one corner. Someone had yanked this out, not in rage, but in silence. Adeline's eyes were glassy when he entered the house. She didn't greet him. She just whispered, "I heard her humming. In the garden. Last night. Same tune she used to hum while brushing my hair." Father Brown said nothing. He simply looked toward the back window, where the garden had long since grown wild. Overgrown roses, cracked statues, a bird bath full of algae. The place hadn't been touched in years, but something glinted at the far edge, near the stone wall, metal reflecting the sunlight. He excused himself and stepped into the overgrowth. Thorns tore at his sleeves. The soil was soft beneath his shoes. The metal was a tin watering can, old and rusted, but what drew his attention was what lay beside it. A single black shoe. Women's, expensive, worn recently. He looked up. Dozens of marigolds bloomed where the earth had cracked. Too many. Too thick. The petals dense and almost wet. Marigolds shouldn't grow in that shade, and not in September. He knelt, brushed them aside. The smell was unmistakable. The soil had been disturbed, and someone had tried to hide it. He dug with his hands, slow and steady, until his fingers found cloth, cotton, blue, patterned with violets. A dress, a body, still soft, recently buried. He didn't uncover the face. He didn't have to, because around the woman's neck was a locket. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. 2 girls laughing in a field. One of them was Adeline. The other was her sister. Father Brown stood and turned to look back at the cottage. Someone had exhumed the dead and brought her back, but not as resurrection, as message. He returned to Adeline, who stared blankly at the wall. "I didn't bury her here," she said. "We buried her at St. Alden's, 40 miles east, next to Mother." "I know," Father Brown replied, "which means someone moved her." The parish records confirmed it. The grave had been disturbed 3 nights ago, dirt scattered, coffin open, empty. The cemetery groundskeeper never reported it. But someone signed the visitor's log, a name no one had heard in years. Father Ainsley. Father Brown sat in the confessional that evening, heart heavy. He had destroyed Ainsley's robe himself, burned it after finding it folded in the vault beneath the altar. He had read the man's final sermons. He had seen the watch, the notes, the gardenias. But now it seemed the former priest had returned, or someone was using his memory as a weapon. The next morning, a new bouquet arrived, this time at the church steps. Daisies, stained red. A note was pinned between the stems, written in Father Brown's own handwriting, but he had not written it. "Bless the flowers. They will tell you the truth." He went to the florist. Geoffrey Tate had vanished. The shop was open, The bell above the door chimed, but the counter was empty. Every window had been covered with newspaper, headlines all from the year 1921. Every vase was filled with marigolds. Behind the counter, on the wall, was a single photograph. It had not been there before. Father Brown stood frozen. It showed him, younger, sitting in the garden of the rectory, a book in his lap, and behind him, blurred but unmistakable, Ainsley, smiling, holding a bouquet of lilies. He took the photograph and left. Outside, the wind had picked up. The streets were empty. The town was quieter than it should have been. Even the birds had stopped. Father Brown returned to Adeline's garden, determined to exhume the body fully, to find the truth buried with her sister's corpse. But the marigolds were gone, all of them, uprooted, the soil untouched. No sign of burial, no sign of flowers, no locket, no shoe, only a note written in the same eerie hand. She was never meant to stay. The room spun. Father Brown stepped back, heart pounding. He turned around and found Adeline standing behind him, pale, barefoot, holding a garden spade in one hand and a bouquet in the other. "They told me to leave the flowers," she whispered. "That was the deal." "Who?" he asked. She didn't answer. She just dropped the spade, and then said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She wasn't my sister anymore. That night, Father Brown could not sleep, because every flower in the churchyard bloomed at once, even the dead ones. He walked among them at dawn, praying under his breath, hands trembling. Every stem stood straight, every petal flawless, the air heavy with perfume. And in the center of the graveyard, where no one had ever been buried, a single mound of fresh earth had risen. A bouquet was placed on top, lilies, still dripping, and at the base of the bouquet, his own rosary. He picked it up slowly. It was warm, the beads slick, as if someone had worn it just moments ago. He turned it in his palm. Carved into the largest bead was a name, his, and beneath it, a final line, scratched in with what looked like a thorn. Chapter 5. Father Brown missed one clue. The killer sat in the front pew at every funeral, and Father Brown never noticed. It had rained all week in Kembleford, the kind of constant quiet drizzle that seeps into the bones and dulls the senses. But death, it seemed, thrived in the damp. 3 sudden deaths in 10 days, all unrelated, on the surface. A farmer found drowned in his own rain barrel. A baker collapsed mid-prayer. A young woman with no history of illness fell lifeless while lighting candles in the church. The coroner blamed age, stress, and freak coincidence. Father Brown didn't, but he missed it. The clue had been right in front of him, sitting calmly through every requiem, folding its hands during every hymn, nodding with every prayer. A pattern so obvious that its very simplicity made it invisible. He had written each eulogy. He had blessed each casket. He had stood no more than 10 feet away from the murderer, smiling, breathing, watching, and still he saw nothing. Until the day he opened the ledger. Father Brown had long kept a record of confessions. Not names, never names, but initials, sins, dates. A private ritual, more for prayer than for analysis. But this time, when he thumbed through the pages, looking for patterns in the grief-stricken town, something strange emerged. The same sin had been confessed 3 times in 3 weeks, under 3 different sets of initials. But the wording was identical. I watched her die. I said nothing. That in itself would have chilled him. But the handwriting? All 3 entries were written in the same hand. Confessions are never written. No one writes them down. unless they want to leave a trail. He checked the parish guest books, the paper trail of comings and goings, sacraments, weddings, deaths. And there it was again. Identical penmanship, different names, different signatures. Someone had created identities, buried them under ink, and then erased them with death. But why? The victims weren't connected by age, wealth, politics, or family, not at first glance. Father Brown stared at the death records until the candles burned low. Then he saw it, not in the cause of death, but in the location. All three had been in the church alone, hours before their deaths. All three had confessed within 24 hours of dying, and all three had used the left confessional booth, the booth that had been unused for years after the fire, the booth no one dared sit in since the day it burned. But someone had opened it again. Someone had whispered through the screen, and someone had walked away with a secret not meant to be shared. Father Brown opened the booth late that night, holding a lantern in one hand and a length of rosary in the other. It smelled faintly of smoke still, though the fire had been extinguished months ago. The wood creaked, dust floated like ash, but behind the screen, where the priest sits, was something new, a small hole carved into the wall. Recently, a tunnel, just wide enough for sound to pass, a whisper path from the outside, from the church garden. He stepped out into the cold, walked around the wall, and found it, a wooden panel hidden in the ivy. Behind it, a stool. Someone had been listening, not just listening, recording. He followed the tunnel down beneath the garden. A root cellar, perhaps once used for food, now converted. Shelves lined the walls, filled with notebooks, each labeled with a name, a date, and a sin. Father Brown's heart nearly stopped. Every confession, every whispered weakness, every cry for absolution, transcribed in ink, violated, stored. He pulled one from the middle, his own, dated 5 years ago, a sin he had buried deep in his soul, never spoken of again. And yet here it was, word for word. Betrayal had never felt colder. And then, in the silence, he heard the music. From above, the organ, playing softly, but no one was in the church. He climbed out fast, shoes slipping in the mud, heart pounding. When he reached the doors, they were open. A single candle lit the nave, and in the front pew sat a man, head bowed, still. He turned as Father Brown approached. He smiled, and Father Brown felt every part of him freeze, because it was the florist, Jeffrey Tate, missing for weeks, presumed dead, but very much alive. "I never lied," Tate said, standing slowly. "I just listened." Father Brown said nothing. His hand clenched the rosary tighter. "They told me secrets," Tate continued, "and I returned the favor. I gave them truth. That's all confession is, isn't it? A transaction." "You killed them," Father Brown whispered. "I didn't touch them," Tate said. "They died of shame, of fear, of the silence that follows knowing you've been seen." And then Tate pointed to the booth. "They confessed," he said, "but not to you." Father Brown backed away, but the organ played louder now, notes out of tune, distorted. He turned to flee, but the pews were full, of flowers, every seat overflowing with bouquets, lilies, marigolds, roses, every flower stained red. And in the pulpit, where he had preached for 2 decades, sat a single box. He opened it. Inside were all the clues he had missed: the ribbon from the lilies, the chipped tooth, the watch, the locket, all of it. And beneath them, a mirror. He lifted it and saw his own face, but not the face of a man who had solved a mystery. The face of a man who had ignored every warning. Because the final note in the box read, You missed one clue, and it was always you. The bells began to ring. No one pulled the rope. Father Brown dropped the mirror. It shattered, and inside the shards, he saw the faces of the dead. He turned to leave, but Tate was gone. The pews were empty, the organ silent, the only sound his own breath, and the whisper of his own voice, asking, "What have I not seen?" He locked the church that night, boarded the booth, burned the notebooks, but still he feels watched. Because there's one clue he still hasn't found, and every Sunday the pews remain full, with people who may not be alive. And every Sunday he preaches, but avoids the left booth, because deep down, Father Brown knows. Chapter 6. The gardener lied under oath. The gardener cried at the funeral, but the corpse beneath the ground had been dead before the fire ever started. They buried her on a Wednesday. Soft soil, closed casket, no open wounds, no obvious cause of death. Just a woman who had gone to bed and never woken up. At least, that's what the town had been told. Margaret Elm's second body this season, laid to rest beneath a sky too bright for morning. The church was filled with lilies, too many. They made Father Brown's head ache as he delivered the final prayer, and just beneath the scent of flowers was something more acidic, like something that had been masked, not mourned. Beside the grave, the gardener stood quietly, hands in his pockets, face streaked with sweat and dirt. Geoffrey Tate, now back from the dead, or never really gone, had resumed his post tending the church grounds. No one questioned it. No one asked where he had vanished to. When pressed, he simply said, "I was pruning." Pruning what? No one knew. But Father Brown had begun to notice the lies stacking like compost. Tate had testified during the inquest into the fire at the rectory garden shed, the one that had supposedly killed Margaret. He had stood before the town council, under oath, and claimed he'd seen her walk into the shed that night. Claimed he'd tried to warn her. Claimed he smelled smoke just seconds before the flames reached the roof. Claimed he ran to fetch water, but it was too late. But that shed was made of old pine. Dry, fragile. It would have gone up in minutes. And yet the coroner's report said her body showed no signs of burning. Not even smoke inhalation. Just silence. No struggle, no injury, just death, already there, before the first spark. And now Father Brown had the photograph. It had arrived in a brown envelope with no return address, placed under the chapel door before dawn. It showed the garden, time-stamped, 10 minutes before the fire began. And in it, Tate was sitting, calmly, on the bench near the roses, staring at the shed, smoking a pipe. The photo was not just proof, it was a warning. Father Brown confronted him later that day, not in anger, but with that quiet gravity that made liars unravel. Tate didn't flinch, he just smiled. "Memory's a funny thing," he said. "Sometimes it grows like weeds." "Or like guilt," Father Brown replied. "You'd be surprised how easy it is to forget," Tate said, "especially when you've buried as much as I have." Father Brown walked the garden alone that night. The soil was damp from the afternoon rain, but something crunched beneath his feet. Not stone, not twig, something more brittle, bone, tiny, animal maybe. But just beside it, fresh boot prints, not his. He followed them. They led to the compost heap, and inside it, wrapped in burlap, was the trowel, the one that had gone missing the night of the fire. The handle blackened with soot. The blade red, not rust, blood, still wet, still fresh. Margaret hadn't died in the fire. She'd been struck, then placed inside. The gardener had lied. But that wasn't the worst of it, because underneath the burlap, tucked into the folds, was a diary. Her diary, Margaret's, pages torn, some burned, others smudged by rain, but enough left to read one line that shattered everything. He said I had to die, to make room for the next bloom. Father Brown couldn't breathe. The next bloom. A phrase Tate had used 100 times when tending the altar arrangements, when he spoke about pruning the old to make way for the new. Margaret wasn't an accident. She was a necessity. But for what? Father Brown returned to the shed, now rebuilt, now sealed. He forced the door open. Inside, everything was pristine. Tools arranged perfectly, floor spotless, except one corner, where the wood was darker. He knelt, pressed his palm to the floor, and it gave way. A hatch. Beneath it, a pit. And inside the pit, bones, too many to count. Some small, some broken. Not just Margaret, years' worth, decades. Father Brown stumbled back, hands shaking. He had blessed this land. He had walked this garden every day. And beneath it, graves. No stones, no names, just flowers. He rushed to the rectory, pulled the records, the town census, the burial books, the death registries, names missing, women mostly, widows, spinsters, the quiet ones, all who had lived alone, all who had gardens, all who had once confessed something to Father Brown, then vanished. And every time, Tate had sent flowers. The next morning, a bouquet awaited him on the church steps. Lilies, a single black ribbon, and a note. I know you've seen it now, but you missed one clue. Father Brown opened the ribbon. It was stitched with thread. Human hair, brown, grey at the ends. Margaret's. He looked to the bench by the roses. Tate sat there, hands folded, smiling, as if nothing at all had happened. Father Brown approached. Why? Tate's voice was calm. They wanted to be remembered. I made sure they bloomed. You're mad. No, Tate said. I'm careful. He stood, handed Father Brown a matchbook from the shed, and walked away. No confession, no plea, just a man who had fed the earth and reaped silence. Father Brown sat alone that night in the pews, matchbook in one hand, diary in the other. But he didn't strike the flame, because he wasn't sure anymore what the truth was, or whether exposing it would cleanse or curse. He looked toward the altar and whispered. Chapter 7. She screamed before he dug. The scream came from underground, and by the time the gardener raised the first shovel of dirt, it had already stopped. It happened just before dawn. No one in Kembleford was awake yet, except for the milkman and Father Brown. He had risen early to write a sermon about resurrection, but he paused when he heard it. The sound of a woman screaming, muffled, strangled by layers of earth. It came from the church garden, and it vanished as quickly as it began, like the gasp of someone who had been buried alive. For a full minute, the silence afterward was louder than any bell that had ever tolled in that village. By the time Father Brown reached the garden, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just dew on the grass and a cold breeze curling between the hedges. But he noticed something strange. A spade, still wet with soil, propped against the tree by the gate. The gardener had already been here. That alone was not unusual. Geoffrey Tate had always worked before the sun rose, but the ground looked freshly turned near the stone wall. The shape of it, a rectangle, slightly raised. It wasn't a flower bed. It was a grave. He touched the soil, still warm. He called for Tate. No answer. He walked the rows. No birds sang. The roses faced away from the grave as if in shame. Then he saw it, just beyond the edge of the turned soil. A white cloth, torn, soiled, A sleeve. He reached for it and pulled gently. The sleeve gave way, but the arm didn't. Something had held it down from below. He dropped the cloth, his hands shaking. This was no ordinary grave. It had been dug in a rush. The soil was uneven, and it had been closed too quickly. Later that morning, the town awoke to news of a missing girl. Eliza Hargreaves, 19, last seen walking home from the chapel after evening choir. She had never arrived. Her parents had assumed she stayed with a friend. Now her room was untouched, her shoes gone, and her pendant, the one her mother had given her, was missing from its hook. Father Brown didn't wait for the constable. He returned to the garden with a shovel. The villagers begged him not to dig. He dug anyway. 3 feet down, the soil turned black. At 4 feet, the smell rose, metallic, sharp, like something not quite dead. And at 5 feet, he saw her face. Eliza, eyes open, mouth frozen in mid-scream, and dirt stuffed into her throat. She had been buried alive. But that wasn't the worst of it, because her hands weren't clutching at the air. They weren't grasping upward in desperation. They were folded, neatly, across her chest, and pinned beneath them was her pendant. It had been placed there after she was silenced. Someone had prepared her body, not in a panic, in reverence. Father Brown closed her eyes and sat beside the open grave until nightfall. The villagers left him alone, as if he were mourning a daughter that wasn't his. But inside, he wasn't mourning. He was unraveling. The next day, Tate was gone. Not missing. Vanished. His tools remained, his wheelbarrow, even his teacup, half full, sitting on the workbench. But no trace of him, except for one, carved into the garden fence. She screamed, but not for help. Father Brown stared at those words until the world blurred, because he understood what they meant. This wasn't murder from hate. This was murder from belief. Someone thought they were doing the right thing, and the earth was their altar. He went to the church ledger, checked the confessions again. Someone had written a name in the wrong place, Eliza's, and beneath it, in parentheses, she saw too much. He flipped back through the pages, dates, confessions, scribbled words, but one kept recurring. She watches from the ground. It wasn't Tate's handwriting. It was older, darker, tighter. The same hand that had written notes decades ago when Father Ainsley served this parish. The same hand that had filled the margins of Ainsley's abandoned sermons. Notes about judgment. Notes about the body. Notes that said, only the soil can keep the secret still. That night, Father Brown returned to the grave. It had been closed. Not by the authorities, by someone else. With care, with precision. He opened it again. The body was gone. In its place, a bundle of lilies, a single hairpin, and a note. You heard her, but you weren't fast enough. His knees buckled. He turned. The garden was empty, but the shadows between the trees moved like breath. And on the bench, resting where Tate used to sit, was a single gardenia. Still wet, still bleeding. The next morning, no one believed him. Eliza was still missing. Tate was still missing. But Father Brown had seen the earth opened, and he had heard it scream. The garden bloomed more brightly than ever that week, every flower flawless. No insects, no decay, only silence. And in that silence, Father Brown heard one final whisper, maybe from the earth, maybe from his own mind. Chapter 8. A glove buried with bones. They found the glove first, still warm, as if the hand that wore it had just let go of the murder. The dig was supposed to be routine. A church expansion, a new rose garden where the old iron fence once stood. It was Jeffrey Tate's final contribution before vanishing. The villagers hadn't seen him for weeks, but his plans were all in order. Diagrams, measurements, flower types, labeled neatly, everything mapped down to the inch. So when the workers began digging, no one expected to find something that shouldn't have been there, something that couldn't have been. Not just bones, but a glove. A woman's, silk, white, stained with something that had once been blood, but now looked more like rust. Father Brown was the first to see it before the constable arrived. One of the workers, pale and shaking, had dropped his spade and refused to touch the earth again. The glove had been curled around a rib cage, not scattered, placed, as if it had been buried with care, not haste. Father Brown picked it up with trembling fingers, turning it over. The stitching on the inside bore a name tag, hand-stitched in delicate thread. One word, Eliza. But Eliza Hargreaves was already buried, or at least she was supposed to be. Her parents had identified the body, the closed casket, the funeral. Father Brown had given the eulogy himself just 2 months ago. But if this glove had been buried with bones, different bones, then whose body had the town mourned? The constable waved him away, said the forensic team would handle it. But Father Brown already knew. This wasn't a new crime. It was an old one that had been covered up beneath the surface of every Sunday Mass. Something that had been growing under the garden like a root system, waiting for just the right moment to rise. He returned to the ledger in his study and found the record of Eliza's burial. Something didn't line up. The date of death and the date of burial were almost too close, just 24 hours apart. No autopsy, no inquiry. The doctor's signature was smudged. He called the doctor himself. No answer. The line disconnected. The next day, the doctor was reported missing. That same morning, another glove appeared on Father Brown's doorstep, still damp, still warm. This one was the left. Now he had the pair. And inside, the second glove was not a name, but a tooth. Small, white, human, clean, and a note folded so tightly it had cut the leather from the inside out. You buried the wrong girl. He dropped the glove, because now he remembered something he had ignored. Eliza's mother had fainted during the viewing. Not from grief, from shock. She hadn't recognized the body, but she'd said nothing. And Father Brown, guilty, trusting, tired, had reassured her it was only the decay, that death changes the face. But now he knew. That wasn't Eliza, which meant two things. First, Eliza was still missing. Second, someone else had been buried in her place, and no one had asked who. Father Brown returned to the garden that evening and dug quietly, alone. He went beyond where the first bones had been uncovered. He dug until the soil turned cold, until it began to resist. And then, another glove. This one black, leather, far too large for a woman. And beneath it, another body. A man, jaw shattered, ribs broken, shirt still on his back, collar marked with faded initials. G.T. Jeffrey Tate. Dead. Gone. But whose gloves had arrived after? Someone wanted him to find the gloves. Someone was trying to guide him to the truth, but leaving enough out to make him doubt everything else. He placed the gloves on the altar that night, lit a candle beside them, sat in silence for hours. The next morning, they were gone. In their place, flowers, lilies, marigolds, daisies, and a ribbon tied in a perfect bow, just like the ones Tate used to make. The note was tucked beneath the petals. She watched him dig her grave. He knew she was still breathing. Father Brown felt his heart stop. That wasn't just a lie. It was a confession, not from the killer, from the victim. Whoever Eliza was, wherever she was, she had been alive when the digging started. She screamed before he dug, and someone heard it and kept digging anyway. The scream that had been heard in the garden weeks ago, that muffled cry that seemed to come from underground, was not a haunting. It was a memory trying to claw its way out of the dirt. And now someone was resurrecting it. But who? He checked the visitor log for the chapel. One entry stood out, written in ink too fresh for the day it claimed to have been signed. Eliza H. for confession. Let the priest bury what he hears. The signature didn't match her old handwriting. But the ink was the same shade used in the ledger, where Father Ainsley's final confession was recorded decades earlier. Ainsley, dead, gone, but his name kept reappearing. Tate, Ainsley, Eliza, and someone still moving among them, leaving gloves like breadcrumbs, like relics from a crime that refused to decay. Father Brown stood in the garden one last time, this time with no spade, no prayer, no certainty. Only one glove now remained, his own, left behind at the grave 2 weeks ago during Eliza's first burial. The constable handed it to him in an evidence bag that morning. Found it beside the coffin, he said. But the coffin wasn't empty. Father Brown opened the photo attached. Inside the casket was Tate, decomposed, folded, not buried upright like before, reburied, switched, moved. Father Brown stepped back from the photo, his eyes going hollow. Someone was replacing the dead, rewriting memory, shifting graves like pieces on a chessboard, and all he had was a pair of gloves that no longer fit anyone living. The church bells rang that evening on their own. The garden gates opened, though the locks had rusted shut, and from the far end of the cemetery, where the oldest graves lay forgotten, came a sound like breathing through dirt. He turned toward it and whispered, Chapter 9. The roses knew too much. The roses started bleeding at dawn. Not metaphorically, truly. Thick crimson droplets beaded on the petals, rolled down the thorns, and soaked the soil beneath the rectory garden like the earth itself was confessing. It was Mrs. Weatherby who saw them first. She screamed so loudly that Father Brown dropped his chalice mid-prayer. By the time he arrived outside, the old woman was trembling at the gate, unable to move past the iron bars. They're weeping, she whispered, pointing. They know what's under them. The villagers dismissed it as a fungus or dew mixed with rust, something mundane. But Father Brown knew better, because these weren't just any roses. These were the same ones that had grown over the last 5 graves, the ones no one had planted, the ones that bloomed the day after each disappearance. Eliza, Margaret, Tate, the unnamed bones in the pit, and the girl with no face they found beneath the bell tower last winter. 5 graves, 5 roses, 5 stories no one could finish, and now they were bleeding. He approached them slowly. The scent was overwhelming, heady, too sweet, the kind that smothers rather than soothes, and beneath it, something metallic, a hint of iron. He reached out and touched the petals. The blood was real, warm, fresh. He pulled his hand back, heart racing. Something had been disturbed. Something wanted to be seen. He knelt at the base of the rose bushes, brushed away the petals. The soil was too loose. He dug, just with his fingers at first, then with a trowel. Half a foot down, he hit wood. A small box, old, warped, bound with twine. He pulled it free, wiped the dirt. From the top, there was a carving, a symbol, a rose split in 2 by a cross. He didn't open it there. He took it into the chapel and set it on the altar, lit 2 candles, closed the doors, and then slowly he untied the twine. Inside the box were 5 items. a lock of hair, a cracked rosary, a child's tooth, a folded photograph, and a petal, dried and blackened. It was a memory box, but not one of mourning, a trophy case. Each item matched a missing person. Each item had been taken just before burial. But that wasn't what made Father Brown recoil. It was the photograph. It was of him, standing in the garden, smiling. And behind him, half hidden among the hedges, was a man in priest's robes, but not his, older, dustier, and in the man's hand, pruning shears, the same shears found beside the first body. Father Ainsley, dead, gone, buried, but watching. The next morning, a rose bush bloomed where no one had planted, right outside Father Brown's window. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he walked the garden in circles, praying, whispering, hoping to feel something holy. But all he felt was pressure beneath his feet, like the ground was breathing, like the garden was listening. He returned to the ledger, the one he swore he'd never open again. He flipped back years, decades, found Ainsley's final entries. Not confessions, not sermons, just names, each one written beneath the symbol of the split rose. And the last name? Brown. It had been there all along. He closed the book, walked to the altar, lit every candle, and waited. Just before dawn, the roses outside began to tremble, windless, silent, but moving. He stepped outside. The bleeding had stopped. In its place, petals, thousands of them, covering the grass like snowfall, and in the center, a glove, white, damp, and wrapped around the handle of a small spade. He picked it up. There was something carved into the handle. 4 words. We bloom for secrets. He didn't dig. Not that day, because the soil had made itself clear. It would not be disturbed without consequence. Instead, he sat in the front pew, hands folded, eyes closed, and whispered. Chapter 10. Eyes Watching. From the greenhouse. The eyes were made of glass, but they blinked when the priest passed by. It began with the sound of shattered panes, not the clean break of an accidental knock, but the long, splintering shriek of something pushed out from within. A gardener's scream followed it, sharp, brief, and instantly silenced. Father Brown was in the sacristy when he heard it echo through the quiet stone walls of St. Michael's. It was the kind of scream that didn't ask for help. It announced death. The greenhouse hadn't been used in years, not since Jeffrey Tate's disappearance. It stood at the far edge of the cemetery garden, half devoured by ivy and shadow, the glass panels dusted with age. The only thing that had touched it recently was the wind, and even the wind seemed reluctant. But when Father Brown reached it, the front doors were ajar, not broken open, unlatched, as if someone had walked inside calmly, without fear, as if they had been invited. Inside, it smelled of something ancient, not rot, but something older, like memory made into mold. The glass shards from the broken ceiling were strewn across the dirt floor like scattered teeth, and in the center of it all, standing perfectly still, was a mannequin. It had not been there the day before. It wore a funeral dress, and its head was missing. Father Brown stared, breath held. The figure was placed deliberately, surrounded by roses, dead ones, their petals blackened and curled like burnt paper. Beneath its feet was a ring of salt, fresh, white, sacred. He stepped closer. Something moved, not a sound, not a breath, a shift in the shadows, and then eyes, dozens, watching from behind the glass panels lining the greenhouse walls, painted onto the panes, wide, wet staring, not artistic, not symbolic. Each one had been done by hand, human-sized, some weeping, some blinking, some closed, but one, Just one, followed him as he moved. He walked the interior slowly, careful not to disturb the salt. At the far end, beneath a dusty table once used for planting, he found a small wooden box. It was unlocked. Inside, a collection of eyeballs, not real. Porcelain, glass, every color, every shade, each one nestled in its own velvet groove. Beside them, a torn page from a hymnal. If thine eye offend thee, pluck it out. He turned to leave, and saw someone standing at the door. A child, eyes hollow, pointing toward the mannequin. Then gone. He ran outside. Nothing, only wind. But on the steps leading back to the church, muddy footprints, tiny, barefoot. That evening, he returned with a lantern and a prayer. This time, the greenhouse had changed. The mannequin was gone. In its place, a chair, a high-backed wooden chair facing the wall of painted eyes, and sitting in the chair, a pair of gloves, folded, blood-stained. Inside the right glove, another note. The dead watched the gardener. He planted them well. Father Brown staggered back, every theory collapsing under the weight of the new horror. The missing were not just buried, they were displayed, arranged, watched. The eyes weren't metaphors, they were memories, each one painted by someone who had seen death and tried to trap it behind glass. He checked the church records again. Every person who vanished had one thing in common. They all worked in the garden at some point. Even the child, especially the child. Her name was Clara. She had disappeared 12 years ago. Her last known activity? Watering the roses beside the greenhouse. The same roses now blackened. The same roses that had bled. He returned one final time to the greenhouse. This time, the eyes were all open and blinking. He smashed one of the glass panes in desperation, but there was nothing behind it, only soil. And in that soil, teeth, human, laid out like seeds. He fell to his knees and wept. When he stood again, the chair was gone, the gloves gone. Only the box of eyes remained. One was missing, and in its place, his own photograph, taken from behind. He looked up, and in the reflection of the only unbroken pane, the mannequin was back, and this time it wore a clerical collar. The greenhouse door slammed shut, and from outside, someone whispered, Chapter 11. The shed held her secrets. They found her wedding dress nailed to the ceiling, and the bones of her fingers still stitched into the sleeves. The shed had been locked for over 2 decades, sealed by rust, shadow, and unspoken rules. No one in Kembleford went near it, not even the boys who dared each other to run between gravestones at midnight. It stood at the edge of the rectory garden, cloaked in ivy and half swallowed by the earth, its windows black with mildew, its door chained shut with 3 iron locks, 2 visible, 1 hidden beneath the wooden cross nailed to the door. Father Brown had passed it hundreds of times over the years, yet never opened it. Geoffrey Tate had once referred to it as the silent corner. Others called it the sleeper's barn. But no one ever gave a straight answer about what it was for, until now. It began with a tremor, an unusual quake that rattled the gravestones and caused the bell tower to groan. Not an earthquake, but a shifting, as if something underneath the church grounds had moved in its sleep. That same evening, a note appeared on the altar. No signature, just 5 words. The shed held her secrets. Father Brown held the slip of paper in his trembling hands and immediately knew what he had to do. He fetched the old keys, the ones buried at the bottom of the rectory drawer, bound together with twine and dust, untouched since Ainsley vanished. He walked through the garden under moonlight, each footstep feeling heavier than the last. the silence too thick to breathe through. When he reached the shed, the door didn't resist. It almost sighed as the first lock snapped open, then the second. But when he reached the third, the hidden one beneath the nailed cross, he paused. He remembered what Tate once whispered before he disappeared. The shed doesn't forget. The third lock came loose, the door creaked open, and the stench that spilled out was not decay, but something worse: memory. The shed was dark, but not empty. Hanging from the rafters were dozens of objects: gloves, ribbons, laces, torn pieces of handkerchiefs, all stained or burned. But at the center of the ceiling, illuminated by a single shaft of moonlight, was a dress, a wedding dress, pale, moth-eaten, and still pristine in places. Its veil was draped like a shroud across the beams, and stitched into the sleeves, unmistakably, were bones, tiny, human, the tips of fingers, still threaded through the fabric. Father Brown couldn't breathe. He stepped further inside, the floor groaning beneath his weight. Along the walls, shelves lined with jars. Inside them, buttons, locks of hair, shards of teeth. Every jar labeled, every one with a name: Adeline, Clara, Margaret, Eliza, and one jar with no label, only a mirror. Inside that mirror, Father Brown saw himself, but not as he was now, as he was 30 years ago. The day Ainsley vanished, the day they sealed the shed. He stepped back, heart pounding, as the light shifted. And then he saw it. The floorboards were loose. He pulled one up. Beneath it, photographs, black and white, blurred. One showed a girl in the wedding dress, standing in the garden, alive. The next, her hand reaching for the shed door. The third, only the dress, crumpled, stained. No body, just silence. And then, beneath the photographs, a diary. The pages smelled of soil and soap. The handwriting was delicate, female. He said the shed would keep me safe, but I heard them nailing it shut. Another page. Every night I scream, but the garden grows louder. And the final entry. I no longer remember my name, only the dress, only the vow, only the lock. Father Brown stepped outside and looked at the church. The bell tower rang once. It was midnight, but no one had pulled the rope. When he returned to the rectory, another note awaited him on his pillow. She was never buried. He rushed back to the graveyard, to Eliza's headstone. He dug and dug, but there was no coffin, no wood, no bones, only dirt and a folded ribbon, the same kind stitched into the veil. Someone had buried the dress, not the girl. He returned to the shed one last time. The dress was gone. In its place, a mirror, a new one, clean, polished, and in the reflection, the girl, wearing the dress, standing behind him, smiling. He turned. Nothing. Only shadows and the sound of breathing that wasn't his. The door slammed shut, and the mirror fogged over. Across the glass, a single phrase, written in breath. Chapter 12. Father Brown dug the truth. The shovel struck wood, and the coffin screamed from the inside. Father Brown had always known it would come to this. The whispers, the vanishing girls, the gardenias left on graves that were never opened, the confessions that never made it to absolution. Every clue had been leading to this one final moment, and he had ignored the one thing that mattered most: what lay beneath. For weeks, the graves had shifted. Subtle things, headstones leaning where they hadn't before, flowers blooming too early, dirt sinking just enough to suggest something below was unsettled. But now, in the midnight cold, with the moon high above and no wind in the air, Father Brown stood over the oldest grave in the churchyard, one that bore no name, no dates, only a single carved word: forgiven. He had always assumed it was symbolic. Now he knew it was literal. The digging had taken hours. His hands blistered, the earth dry and stubborn at first, then strangely soft, like it wanted to be moved, as if it had waited years for someone to dare. And when his spade finally struck the rotting edge of the wooden box, the sound it made was not the dull thud of contact. It was a scream, faint but undeniable, reverberating not through the air, but through the ground. He froze, then kept digging. The coffin was not like the others. It had no cross, no hinges, no seal. Just thick black nails, driven in at uneven angles. Inside, he expected bones. But when he pried it open, what he found was far worse. Eyes, dozens, lined across the interior walls, glass, porcelain, human, each eye staring forward, each one suspended in a velvet cradle, arranged with precision, like an audience waiting for a curtain to rise. And in the center of the coffin, resting on silk, was a mirror. No reflection showed in it, just darkness. He lifted it with shaking hands. On the back, carved into the frame, "I buried them all, but I kept watching." Father Brown staggered back. This wasn't a grave, it was a journal, a record of the ones no one had claimed. The girls whose names had vanished from the rolls, the confessions that had been scratched out, the deaths that had been called accidents. He realized then, each eye belonged to a memory, each pair a soul left unseen, and someone had kept count. At the bottom of the coffin, beneath the mirror, lay the final clue. A collar, his collar, stained, and beneath it a single photo. A child, Clara, standing in front of the greenhouse, alive and smiling. Behind her, the priest. But it wasn't Father Brown, it was Ainsley, smiling back, holding a spade and looking directly into the camera. Father Brown turned the photo over. A message had been written in ink so dark it had soaked through the paper. "He buried me first, so I'd never tell, but I'm still here, beneath the church, beneath the sermons, beneath you." The sky cracked with thunder, and the coffin began to collapse inward, imploding like lungs crushed by guilt. Father Brown scrambled back, the earth swallowing the box as if it had never been opened. The grave refilled itself in silence. The wind returned, and behind him, the bells rang. 12 chimes, midnight, the witching hour. He turned toward the chapel, and in the flickering candlelight through the stained glass, he saw them. Shadows seated in every pew, all facing forward, all waiting. He stepped inside. The altar was drenched in flowers, gardenias, blood-red lilies, marigolds, and on the pulpit, his Bible, open to a page that had never existed, a 13th chapter, handwritten. The text read, "Blessed are those who forget what they have buried. Cursed are those who dig too deep." The last line was in a different hand, Eliza's. "You found us, too late," and then the candles blew out, one by one, leaving only silence, and from the back of the church, movement, a soft step, a whisper, not words, breath. He turned toward the sound and saw her, Clara, wearing the dress from the shed, her hands stitched together, her eyes gone. But she smiled, and in her mouth, a key. She placed it at his feet and vanished. He bent down. The key was old, rusted, but carved with one word: truth. And on the stone beneath it, scrawled in ash,